This is Richard Reynolds. You probably know me from the Culture and Enterprise programme as the course leader of MA Applied Imagination, but I'm also the joint head of academic support for the college, and I'm going to be talking to you about, in this session, about dissertation, planning and research. I'm just going to put my slides up on the screen. There we go. There we go. And so this is an academic support or study support session, and it's about improving your performance, and in this particular instance about dissertation planning and research, because I know that you're moving into the dissertation phase of your course and you need to think about how you'll be doing your dissertation in the third year and creating your dissertation proposals. I think there are certain rules about dissertation planning and research that apply to all major pieces of work, and a lot of what I'm going to say is applicable, say, to a major project on an MA course, as well as a project like a BA dissertation, which I see a great deal of across many courses in the college with third-year students. One of the things that they all have in common is that planning and research can't begin until you have a question or a brief. And of course, through the processes of many courses, we're used to responding to briefs that we get from tutors. The thing about a dissertation that is a little bit different, it's getting a bit closer, if you like, to postgraduate work, is that it is a piece of work where you have created a brief for yourself. That's very exciting because it gives you the opportunity to work in depth about something that passionate, you care about, it's important to you, but it also creates new problems, levels of difficulty that we're not used to if we regard education in a more passive way as something that there's already an existing right answer that we simply have to get to. When you move to this level of work, it becomes about creating your own question as well as attempting to respond to it. Things become just a little bit more difficult, but they become difficult in a way that we're not used to them being difficult. It's a new kind of challenge. So to sum that up, if you have a brief, then the scope of your research is already defined by your brief, but in a self-directed project, you are responsible for yourself for selecting and planning the area of your research. Now, one of the formulas that people use to think about this, and I'm aware that you use this on BACCC, and it's something I'm going to go into in a little bit of depth in the next few minutes, is what we call the what, why, how, if formula. It's a very simple formula. It's a way of breaking down a project that we're planning into 4 aspects and then working on those separate aspects. What am I going to be doing or studying or researching? Why? Why would I do that? Why does that matter? How? Perhaps the longest part. The methodology. How will you do this? And if, very important but often overlooked, the payoff. If I achieve this outcome, where will that place me? And is that a place I actually want to be in? So let's begin by thinking about what. What is the subject or general area that you intend to research? There's a number of different ways we arrive at this. Sometimes we arrive at it through playing around with our ideas, through general reading, through discussion, through something that strikes our interest in a lecture or a conversation, a tutorial, something that you see online or in the news or you read. But then, in order for that to progress, it has to become something just a general area of interest. It has to eventually evolve into a research question, a definite starting point. What is the precise question or brief that you will be addressing? And that in itself is a very difficult and challenging journey to take, to move your research from a general area of interest, of something that you're even passionate about, into a specific and quite detailed, quite precise starting point for your research. And this, of course, is the point where students have a lot of conversations with tutors, with stakeholder leaders, with course leaders about the scope, the size, the question or the area that they're involving themselves with. Is it possibly too narrow, or probably more likely, is it too broad? And how original, how special, how different, how open to the creation of new knowledge should the dissertation question be? Now, here's where is where I'd invite you to take a step back and think in a way that's perhaps slightly different to the way that you normally think in your education. Think about yourself. What do you like? Where are you in this question? Because, as I said right at the beginning, this is a very personal piece of work. It's something that you are deciding to do. You're deciding to write about rocket ships rather than wedding dresses, or you're deciding to write about Jimi Hendrix rather than J.K. Rowling. And this is a decision that only you are in a position to make, which means that actually the question becomes about you and what truly motivates and interests you. And that sounds easy, but in fact it's not, because it means bringing some of ourselves into our own work, and that's an experience that doesn't happen so much until you get to this level of study, this level of education. You have to think about yourself. You have to think about your own responses to these areas and how you feel about them. That's why I put these sentences in colours, because we're talking about emotions. We're talking about the relationship here between your emotional life and the work that you're thinking about, so that you become convinced that this is something that you feel is worth spending your time on. What do you care about? What makes you feel passionate? What makes you angry? What fascinates you? You know, these are emotions. These are feelings that only you have the ability to gauge in terms of how you respond to them in your work. And what will you take away from this dissertation? Very important, because the thing about a self-directed piece of study is that you are doing it for yourself. It comes out, it derives from your relationship between yourself and the subject matter you're working from, not as a way of necessarily second guessing or flattering or pleasing those people in terms of your choice of subject matter who you feel are going to assess you. Of course, there are learning outcomes to achieve, but these should be achievable with any piece of subject matter that you feel prepared to go into with sufficient depth and with sufficient rigor and creativity. So, really is about you in a very important way. Or as I put it in this slide, the question which you ask, or the hypothesis which you propose, in a slightly different kind of project, does define the direction of your research, and therefore you should test its validity at every available opportunity. Another way of saying that is to turn that round on its head and say, turn that upside down on its head and say, don't expect your first idea to be brilliant. You know, a research question is something to be arrived at through an iterative process of learning gain, from thinking about things until you circle in, you zone in on a question that really works. In some courses, for example, in my own MA, we have a whole series of projects, 3 or 4 connected projects, which are intended to take students through a process of investigation of a general area until they arrive at a point where they feel that they have a personal question that connects with their subject area, but also connects with their own personal agenda in their life, which is really one of the things that we're at university and we're art school to allow to happen to us, isn't it? It's to develop that special angle of vision about who we are, what we can do, to protect that uniqueness and bring it to the forefront of your plans. Like the Bird's Nest Stadium, which was a very unique piece of work by Ai Weiwei, before a whole lot of other things that have subsequently happened to him happened, but represents a very unique way of thinking. What's unique and special about you? If you can somehow foreground in your dissertation, both through your choice of subject matter and the way that you approach it and the way you go about the research, and indeed the knowledge and the networks of research that you create through the execution of your dissertation, then you will have taken a huge step forward into defining who you are in terms of currently your academic and subsequently your creative and your professional identity. So if you feel that this dissertation question, this subject, this what that you're looking for, will give you considerable scope in order to develop and help you project the uniqueness of your vision as a critic, as a creative, as a practitioner, then it's probably developing into rather a useful question. Looking at that a little bit more forensically or diagnostically, some of the characteristics of a good research question might be that it's capable of development into a research plan, which means that very generalized or very abstract, very almost rhetorical, philosophical questions are not always very likely to be fruitful. It should be able to be connected with established theory, because if it doesn't connect at all with any established theory, it's going to be very difficult for you to show, to showcase, to foreground the knowledge that you have of your subject and the methodology that lies behind, in this case, the BACCC course. It needs to be linked to current practice or research, because we're all dwarfs standing on giant shoulders. We all depend, whether we're aware of it or not, which is an important thing to consider. How aware are you actually of all the work that's gone before you into the area you're looking at? We're all linked to current practice. One of the ways you demonstrate that you are a fine and original scholar is that you are aware of the debt that you owe to others, and therefore very much aware also where you're able to make a new and unique contribution. Which leads to the next bullet point. What you're doing needs to be linked to current or previous practice, but if it is linked to that practice, it also needs to show that you have, even at this level, at third year BA dissertation level, you want it to have the potential for making a contribution to new knowledge, however modest. But despite all these very ambitious points in the bullet point above, it also obviously needs to be realistic in scope, in the sense that it's absolutely not helpful to scope out a subject that is going to be completely undoable and unachievable within the time and the resources that you have to devote to your dissertation. So it needs to be realistic in scope, considering the time available to complete your research. A few years ago, at a meeting of external examiners on the MA course I work on, one of the externals came up with this rather, to me, initially puzzling metaphor, and then the penny dropped with me about what he was saying. He said, in a self-directed project, a good question could be like a roundabout. You know, we're very fond of them in this country. In America, they call them traffic circles, roundabouts, where the cars go round and round, and eventually you find the right exit. I didn't quite get what he was saying when he first said it, and then it kind of fermented, settled down in my imagination for a while, and I realised what he was getting at. That the thing about a roundabout is, if you miss your exit, you can always go round again and pick it up the next time around, which has certainly happened to me a few times in my career. And a good question should be able to do this. It allows you to keep all kinds of options, outcomes, ways of finally addressing the question alive, in play, if you like, whilst you continue to develop your research, and so that you're not stuck with one answer. You know, the most long-term, unfulfilling, unrewarding kind of research questions are the ones that boil down to something rather like just a yes-no proposition, and you spend a great deal of effort and time and research simply validating a conclusion which you've already reached and which probably no one else would disagree with. It's not terribly exciting to read, and it doesn't really teach you a great deal about your subject if in fact the answer has been with you since the very beginning and it doesn't change very much through the development of the project. So, a good research question keeps different options alive and makes a variety of developmental routes available to you. Now let's move on to why. We've just done what, and we're considering the question of why. Why this subject? Why will this research be of particular value to you and of potential interest or value to others? Why does your research have a unique validity and integrity for you? And here's the thing, every project we do, well, really everything we do in life, but certainly every academic project we do, has to at some point address the why question, either explicitly or implicitly. And if the why is implicit, if we've never really surfaced it, we've never considered it openly, then it's a bit of a danger that we're not really thought through the reasons deeply why we're doing something. Maybe we've only thought about part of the why question. You know, why would I need to do this? Because I need to get my degree. I need to pass this unit in order to get the degree. Well, that's one part of the why, but it's not the whole of the why, because in an optional project, a project where you are self-directed, there are many different ways you can achieve that goal, and it would be wiser, more exciting to achieve it through doing something that you're actually going to find developmental to you, so something that interests you as well as being of interest to other stakeholders, to others involved in the project. And if you go back to the Olympics metaphor, that's one of the original designs for the stadium of the London Olympics. It was never quite built in the form it's represented there. That was one of the earlier designs. A huge project, a massive project like the Olympic Games coming to a particular city. There's always a why. Sometimes it's not verbalized. Sometimes the why is so deeply implicit that it's never even talked about. I mention this is particularly useful at the moment because it's entirely available online, and so it's something you can look at the original documents, even though we're in lockdown. Sydney Opera House, I guess one of the most famous buildings in the world. All of the tender documents are available for that online on a New South Wales government website, because it was a government project, and you can read the tender documents from the mid-1950s when Sydney Opera House was first being proposed. All of the specifications that the government of New South Wales wanted for the project, how big the two auditoria were supposed to be, how many toilets, how many bars, how many people would be seated, all of that detail. It doesn't say anywhere in the tender documents for Sydney Opera House that this needed to be a cultural monument to the emergence of Australia as a major cultural as well as economic nation. That was implicit. But the guy that got the commission to design the Opera House, Jorn Utzon, understood from the brief that the government of New South Wales wanted something exceptional, something that would change the perception of Australia, and his did recognize that hidden agenda in the brief. That why we're not just designing this so that several hundred people can listen to opera at the same time in that part of Sydney. It's being created in order to change perceptions about Australia and the world and Sydney. And I think when you're thinking about your own project, you want to look below the surface of your own why rather deeply in that kind of way. So what are the other reasons why I'm doing this? Not just, I think it's a convenient or, you know, an easy or even a difficult subject to choose for my dissertation, but what does it say about me and why am I engaged? Why do I care about this subject? Why do I feel passionate about this subject? Why does this make me feel angry? Why am I fascinated by this? And are you highly motivated to go further and more deeply into those feelings and into that engagement, because that's the direction that you want yourself to be taken in? Very, very important. So to sum up the why concept, it essentially has two sides, two parts to it. There's the private side to it. Why do I care about this? Because if you don't care about the work you're doing, then you're going to be very bored and unhappy. And if you feel that others don't care about the why of your project, then it's going to be very difficult for you to engage with other people and to get responses, to get reaction, to gain traction eventually if you pursue this subject further on into your career in the outside world. So there are always these two sides to why: the personal side to motivate yourself, and the public side as to why this will interest anybody else. So that was what, and that was why. Now let's consider how. How will you research and answer your question in practical terms? How will you engage with the relevant theoretical backgrounds and methodologies? How will you develop your self-management strategy? How will you manage your research and eventually your writing schedule? Now, these are practical organizational questions, but they also have a very deep bearing on the pedagogic, on the learning value, on the learning gain that you're going to get from your from doing your dissertation. Let me suggest what I'm saying is represented in this diagram. So if we make things too easy for ourselves, if you look at that little diagram, you've got the aim, the outcome, the ambition, if you like, of the project, represented by that black and orange cross in the top left-hand corner. And then you've got your comfort zone and your current skill set around it. If the how of your project stays very resolutely and determinedly within your comfort zone, and you have dragged that black and orange cross back inside your current skill set and even back inside your comfort zone, then by definition, you're not going to be learning very much from doing the project. You're going to be repeating, reiterating things that you already know or you already know how to do. If, on the other hand, you're ambitious and you're not afraid of taking a few risks in your choice of subject, but also in the ways that you're going to go about investigating that subject, researching it, in the end representing it, and the conclusions, the arguments you're going to launch about it, then the gain, the learning from doing the project is going to be that much greater. And I shouldn't say this, but probably the kind of level of grade you're going to achieve is probably going to be the greater because. So how it's not just a question of cold planning, although that has to be part of it. It's also a measure of your ambition. How much are you prepared to extend yourself in terms of the way that you carry out and deliver this project? What, why, how, if? This is one that often gets overlooked, but it's very important. If you complete this research, how will it position you? Is this actually going to take you to a place where you want to be? And looking beyond the immediate outcome of your dissertation, is your project something which, if successfully completed, will actually be of lasting value in your personal and professional, as well as academic development? Sometimes I experience sudden moments of revelation with students from time to time when I put this question to them and they suddenly realize that they're not going to get to do this bit of work over again, and that perhaps they've been thinking about it very strategically. They've been second guessing the kind of thing that they feel is wanted by the course, by the tutor. They've not been leaving anything in it for themselves, and they suddenly recognize that this place, this destination, this terminus that the dissertation or the piece of research work, whatever it is going to take them to, it's not actually the place they want to be. It's someone else's destination. But once you surface this question, it then feeds back, if you like, retroactively on the what and the why. It gives people another perspective on that. Oh yeah, this really is actually about me, isn't it? And it's about what I want to do. And if I do that what for that why, it's taking me to a place that actually isn't really quite where I want to be. It's making me not quite into the person I want to be at the end of doing this work. So if it's very important, it's a kind of marker point. It's the long distance target that you're shooting at. If you like, it's the reason that the whole exercise exists in the first place. So when we've looked at what, why, how, if, it's well worth then stepping back and taking a more holistic view. The research question, the whole project as a single entity, the what, why, how, if, the journey, insofar as you're able to see it at this stage that you're going to take. Are you convinced that your question clearly defines the area that you wish to research? Does the whole thing convince you if you play it back to yourself? It's going to be a bit like looking at yourself in a mirror and a funhouse mirror, and suddenly the nature of the project looks very different when you look at it back in the mirror of reflection. Does the project allow you freedom and scope to develop as your research broadens and deepens your engagement with the field? We've touched on that earlier, talking about, in a way, are there enough surprises? Is the project ambitious enough to allow you to grow through doing it? Are you convinced that this project is something in which you wish to invest a great deal of time and effort? That holistic view, that looking at it, if you like, in the funhouse of reflection, the funhouse mirror, is a very good way to do what we call a self-check and decide if this is something that you really want to engage with. Okay, so that's part of the planning phase. What, why, how, if. Will give you, if you've got a robust what, why, how, if, you will almost certainly have a project that makes a certain kind of sense and is doable. And of course, the first step that we need to take, first steps that we take beyond that, once we've got a what, why, how, if, once we have some kind of a plan, is to begin a process of research. What is research at this level? Lots of ways we could answer that question. There are philosophical answers to what research is. There are very practical answers, and there are answers rooted in what you are actually going to do in your own work. Well, I believe in a certain amount of planning for research, but I certainly don't believe in over-planning. I don't believe in over-planning of research, and I don't believe in too much note-taking either, which we'll get to a bit later. Don't make the mistake of over-planning research, because the whole point of research, or one of the key points of it, is that it's going to contain surprises. You're going to discover things that you didn't know were even there to be discovered. So if you over-plan your research before you've even begun it, you tend to minimize the opportunity for the unexpected, and that, in a way, takes away a lot of the point of being a researcher. Make a rough plan. Divide up the weeks and months you're going to spend on research, but then leave some flexibility. Leave the possibility for the unexpected that's going to take you into another direction. Research almost inevitably is a largely independent activity. Whether we're allowed to do it in the library or able to do it in the library, like in that picture, or whether we're behind a computer screen. But doesn't mean that it's solitary, because research is all about making connections with texts, with objects, with artifacts, but also with people. Now, you know all this, so I probably don't need to spend very much time on this, but you have essentially two kinds of sources in your research work. Primary sources, original objects, photographs, magazine, newspaper images, raw data, personal testimony of lived experience, interviews, questionnaire responses. These are all primary research materials. There are many different kinds of them. And then, of course, there are also secondary resources, books about, texts about a given subject, history and theory. Perhaps more important than that, though, are what I call the different stages or phases or different types of research that you might engage in at different types of a project. A lot of different names for these, and I've given them names of my own for the purposes of this lecture, but you'll find people discussing these same concepts using different terminology. But research is not one activity, it's several different activities that fit together into a kind of story about how you go about investigating your subject. And I give them the names of holistic or strip mining, question-based or the detective method, and targeted, and I sometimes call that the great escape method. There's nothing right or wrong about these different approaches to research, but they're all pertinent at different phases of your project. So let's talk about these a little bit. So with strip mining, sometimes some people call it scoping. This is an activity you're probably going to engage in quite a lot in the early phases of your project. It's a bit like turning over half a mountain just to see what the mountain's got inside of it. So you're turning over a lot of earth, a lot of soil, a lot of rock, like in this kind of strip mine, to find what you want, because you don't quite know what you're looking for. So you've got to dig through a lot of different areas. Scoping, strip mining, investigating something in a very broad or general way. The problem, of course, with this kind of scoping or strip mining research is that there's an enormous amount of knowledge in the world. There's an enormous amount of knowledge just in the area that you want to research, and therefore it's not possible to know everything. Eventually, we have to narrow down into a research question and a more precise methodology how we're going to use our time and how we're going to focus our research. Now, oppositely, towards the end of our research process, instead of trying to dig up the whole mountain, we have a very clear line. We've got the outlines of our dissertation. We probably actually have written parts of it, and we don't want to dig up a whole mountain. We want to get from A to B. We want to dig through the soil and come out in a particular place, like an escape movie from a prison camp. We want to come out in the right place, dig through the tunnel, and not waste our time digging up a whole mountain or going down a whole lot of side tracks that don't go to where we want to go. Now, of course, can't really do a whole project like this because you'd never find where you wanted to, you'd never find a direction to go into. But when we get into the last weeks of our writing and research, we really do come to a problem. We really do often come to a point where we kind of decide we don't really want to have any more big ideas, or we don't want to open up any new vast areas or realms of experience and understanding for our work, because we're going for the tape. We're running for the finishing line. Then there's the kind of research, third kind, the detective method, or you might call it a problem-solving approach, where we have a question and we're looking for evidence in a more forensic way, the way that a detective investigates a crime and looks for evidence of a particular activity, whether it's Sherlock Holmes or anyone else. We're problem-solving. And in the detective method, we've got our question, but we don't have our answer. You might say in the scoping phase or the strip mining phase, we're looking for our question. We're digging up the mountain to find our question. You might say in the great escape or finishing phase, we've got our answer and we're just trying to flesh it out and present it. In the detective stage, method, we've got our question and we are assembling evidence in order to articulate a response to it. So there's an organizing principle behind what we're doing, but we haven't got a single unified outcome in view. We're still looking for the crime. I sometimes say to people, the homicide detective has the advantage that they're handed the dead body to investigate the murder. As research students, we have to go out and first commit the murder, shoot the body, find our dead body so we can start our investigation. Now, very often it's in this detective phase, or perhaps you might, even to be a little more precise, you might say it's in the transition from the scoping phase to the detective phase, where we've got a problem and we're looking for evidence to understand it, that people complain that they're lost. It's very funny because people who are researching, who come to you and say they feel lost, often say it with a sense of as if this shouldn't have been allowed to happen, that they shouldn't ever have the experience of feeling lost in their research. And they can sometimes be relieved, surprised, but relieved if you get back to them and say, well, that's great, I'm excited that you feel lost. It shows that you're obviously exploring off the map and really learning a lot of new material. It's okay to feel lost. You're looking for the answer. You're moving into detective mode. There's lost and there's very lost. Lost in the sense that you think you've got an interesting question, but you haven't found perhaps enough material to answer it, or even convince yourself that it is a good question. Then there's feeling very lost when not even sure you've got a question and that nothing seems to fit together at all. But however lost you feel, nothing better really than pressing on and just continuing to allow yourself to get more lost, to go deeper into the subject. Because if you you relax into the feeling of being lost in an open-minded way without fear, something always happens. It's remarkable. If you let go from your sense that you need to feel in control all the time of your intellectual creative processes, a kind of magic happens, almost always, I would say always, and that something emerges, some exciting new idea. Because our brains are very complicated things, and a lot of what they do we're not aware of. A lot of the connections that go on at a physiological, neurological level between the synapses of the brain. You know, it's that feeling when you're trying to remember something. Oh, it's on the tip of my tongue. The neurons are firing. They're trying to connect the two ideas, and they get there. And it's the same with feeling lost in a creative project. We have this ability to find ourselves. It's hardwired into who we are. And very often the only thing that's stopping us finding ourselves is anxiety, intrinsic anxiety about the very fact that for the moment we've lost our bearings, which is in fact the moment where we've allowed something new to happen. And then we find this fascinating place on the lost highway called serendipity. We find this object that we weren't expecting, this answer, this new idea. Now, I'm not going to show this now, but I'll embed the link to this with this lecture. And when we talk about this lecture afterwards in the Q&A phase, I'm going to ask you all to look at a very short clip from the movie Dirty Harry, which I will send the link to so it can be embedded on Moodle. It's a 5-minute clip from the beginning of a Clint Eastwood movie from the early 70s, where Clint Eastwood, playing the detective Dirty Harry, well, we first of all witness the murder of a young girl in a swimming pool. I'm sorry, it's slightly violent, but it is a detective story. Then we're introduced to Dirty Harry, the detective, and he goes through the process of initially scoping and investigating the crime. And it's very, very interesting to watch the processes he goes through in this investigation until the moment where he discovers something very, very interesting at the end of the clip that I'm going to link you to, which puts a completely different light on the murder that we've seen. It's a very interesting piece of filmmaking in its own, but I think most interesting for our purposes at the moment is what the Dirty Harry clip has to say about the processes of inductive logic that go on in terms of thinking about solving a crime. So maybe we can have a Q&A about that after the lecture and after you've all had a look at the link to the clip. Now let's think about recording research. This is where I give you a fair health warning here. I'm going to say some things which probably go against things that you've learned when you're at school and might even sound a bit irresponsible, maybe go against things that you've learned at university. But I have to say I'm not a fan at all of taking extensive notes. I've never been a big note taker, and it never seemed to do me any harm, quite the reverse in fact, in terms of my academic achievement. I have a very controversial view on this, but I'm prepared to stand by it, that a lot of note taking is totally a displacement activity. In other words, something to do to keep us occupied, to prevent us from actually getting on with the thing we really need to do. Of course, I'm not saying that when you find a useful piece of text, a book you want to put in your bibliography, a quote you want to use, get the location of that down correctly in the Harvard system first time round. Always get that material down accurately. What I'm talking about is not taking extensive notes on your reading, but rather moving rather more quickly and even, you might say, aggressively to the stage of actually getting something down on your computer which you can use for yourself. That's a real plan of my own for a chapter of a book that I'm working on, a published book. I don't plan any more than that. When I've got something like that down on paper, then I start writing. I don't think you need to plan any more detail than that. So instead of making very extensive notes of your reading and other research, I would thoroughly recommend you instead to focus on reflective writing, which explores why your research has meaning or significance for you. What I mean by that is, instead of just writing down the meaning of a passage as you see it, which you can always recover if you've got the bibliographic reference by just going back and reading it again, I would very much recommend you go a step further and write down why you think this is important and why it might be a part of your dissertation, because then you've taken the jump into bringing yourself into the research. You've surfaced the question why, not why about the whole project in this case, but why about this piece of material? Why is this an important part of my dissertation? If you get that, you've managed to capture that in words, you've then got something that starts to be the first draft of what might eventually finish up as part of your dissertation. It's gold dust. It's something to save you from that horrible experience of looking at a blank screen. And having these pieces of reflective writing about your work will help you to build a fluent argument rather than simply assembling a mass of disconnected facts. We'll come back to this subject of turning research into text in the second one of these lectures, which I do, the one about actually writing, which very much deals with this whole process of how you can begin using your research as the first stage of your writing, and how you can keep up a momentum in your project that derives from the way you do your research and the way you record your research, that leads directly into achieving a first draft with the minimum amount of pain and the maximum expression of what you want to say. This leads us pretty directly actually to the question of time management in research, which is a very problematic thing, because when we deal with research, when we speak of research, we're talking about something always that has the potential to be infinite, to be of infinite size, and yet we don't have infinite time. So I'm going to suggest a few strategies and techniques to try to ensure that the time you spend on your research is used effectively. This is one of Carolan's amusing nonsense machines, an hourglass to stop time. A glass, I think he calls it, for those who use their hours sparingly. So the grains of sand are not grains of sand, they're grains of rock, and they can't fall through the narrow waist of the egg timer, the hourglass, and therefore time stops. Oh, if only it were that way. Sadly, it's not, is it? Although I used to have a colleague in the publishing company I used to run, my editorial director, Marcus Hearn of Reynolds and Hearn, who really did believe he had a gadget like this on his desk, and he would believe somehow he could put in a sprint on the last days of a project and do 5 times more work in one day than he'd ever done before. And he would do twice as much, but never 5 times as much. Measuring time, allowing for time, there's a subject for a whole lecture here that I do about time management, but measuring time is very difficult, understanding how we use time, because we do not have an organ in our body that directly senses the passage of time. We only sense time indirectly through motion, and you can show by very simple experiments like asking everybody in the class to close their eyes and put their hand up when they think 2 minutes have passed, which I've done a lot of times with classes of students. You can demonstrate very effectively that people's subjective sense of how time passes is very, very different. With the 2 minutes game, some people will put their hand up after about 50 seconds and others will still not have raised their hand after 4 or 5 minutes. So if one person's 2 minutes is 3-4 times as long as someone else, how on earth do we effectively plan time? Well, I think only by being honest with ourselves and thinking about it in terms of how we use it personally. Self-deception, being like an ostrich with our head in the sand, is perhaps the biggest problem we face when we try to organise our time in order to complete a major piece of work, research for a dissertation, any large project. you have to do a big project as yourself. You don't have the option to carry it out as someone else, and therefore you have to make the assignment work for you in terms of the way that you organize your day. For example, if you're a morning person, if you're the kind of person who loves to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and work for 3 hours before breakfast, so be it. That's how you're going to get your project done. If you're like me, you're more of an afternoon, evening, night person, you're going to be much more effective working in the second half of the day, and you might as well recognize that and work with it and not be constantly working against the grain of your own personality, of your own biorhythms. One of the things about self-directed study, any kind of self-directed work, is that we do have to fall back on our own understanding of how we operate as individuals. I mean, it's no coincidence I'm recording this lecture for you, and I'm recording it in the late afternoon. That's no coincidence. I wouldn't want to record a lecture like this, sort of a 50-minute, 1-hour lecture at 8 o'clock in the morning, because I wouldn't feel I'd do a terribly difficult job of it. If others' working days could be stretched, I'd be happiest probably recording this material at 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night. But we're all different, and as you spend longer in independent research, I think you do slowly come to understand your own rhythms better and therefore work with them and not against them. It doesn't have to be all about you. Just because it's independent study, it doesn't mean you can't involve other people. You can involve others in your own self-management strategies. And that might, for example, be working with a study buddy. It might mean taking the opportunity to bounce your ideas off others and keep a check on each other's progress. Have someone else to say, hey, did you write those 500 words today that you said you were going to write? It's very useful to have someone else to share the pain, share the moments of achievement. In terms of doing it as ourselves and not trying to pretend to be someone we're not just because it's a piece of academic work, that also, apart from time management, shades over into the whole area of how we think and how we write. So maybe you like to do everything on the computer. That suits you, but maybe not. Maybe you're the kind of person that likes to cover the wall with different color post-it notes and then move the orange and yellow and pink ones around like this lady's doing until you get an understanding the argument that you want to develop. If that's how you want to work, that's how you want to work. All this is about integrating your research, integrating your project so it lives in the same space as your life, that it's not something alien to you that you feel but every time you get involved with, you're somehow going against some deep biorhythm or inner part of yourself that's resistant to you doing the work. Take this gentleman, for example. He's got a magnificent, beautiful set of teeth because he brushes them every morning. And why does he brush them every morning and not forget? Because brushing his teeth when he gets up in the morning is an absolutely intrinsic part of the routine of his day. It doesn't occur to him not to do it. And that's kind of what we're aiming at, isn't it? We're aiming to integrate our creative work, our research into the rhythms of our life so that it becomes a certain time of the day is natural to sit at our computer or in other circumstances go to the library, in the same way that when we first get out of bed in the morning, it's natural for us to decide to, well, not decide, we don't have to think about it. We brush our teeth because that's when we do it. That's about finding the rhythms in your day and in your week that allow you to study without pain and without fighting other commitments, maybe work commitments, paid money work, social commitments, family commitments that are pulling you in different directions at other times. Another way to work with your flow rather than against it is, this is a kind of a Zen Buddhist approach to life, is to not be working on the overall huge task, but to constantly break down the major task into a series of small tasks. So the gentleman at the top feels lost and stuck because he feels he's not accomplishing anything. He's doing the same bit of work round in a circle every day. The gentleman on the underneath is on a straight road that actually gets to where he wants to go. He knows he's not going to cover the whole journey in one day or one march, but if he keeps going a certain amount each day, he'll get to the end. You know, some of the word counts for dissertations, thousands of words, can seem very daunting. It may be more writing than you've ever done for one project in your academic career. But you know, a dissertation, even a 40,000 word and master's dissertation or 100,000 word doctorate dissertation, is only a set of so many bits of 500 words that somebody might, or 1,000 words that somebody might sit down and work at a sitting. So if you have a definite, precise number of words in mind to write in a particular day, you will get there in the end. And it's the same with research. You can't read the whole contents of the library in one day, but if you can read 100 pages per day, that will take huge bites out of your reading list over time if you stick at it. Secret really here is not to let it all get on top of you, to keep a sense of the overall aim at all times, to be flexible, and to allow the research to fit in with the rhythms of your life, but also to be realistic about it. I'm going to talk more about this topic in the second one of these lectures when I talk about, to me, the vital art of how to stop researching, which of course is something that has to happen because research can never go on forever, but it's not something I think we think about or certainly learn and teach very much, the process of stopping research. And that's covered in the second one of these lectures. In the meantime, though, advice for when beginning research, the process is to keep all your references clear. I'm not suggesting you make a lot of notes, but for goodness sake, always get your references clear and precise. Don't leave them all to do at the end when you might have forgotten them. So, to conclude in this part of the lecture, I think honesty is the most important thing about research and planning. Be honest with yourself about your research, and if things are not progressing as they should, have a talk with your tutor sooner rather than later. Key points about research and time management, 5 suggestions. Be clear about the what, why, how for your research. So how does this work I'm doing now fit in with the what, why, how, if matrix that I have defined? Differentiate clearly between different forms of research. You know, it might not be a good idea near the end to suddenly depart off on a huge strip mining or scoping process of some new idea. Try to record the results of all research in a dynamic way so that you're not stuck with a whole heap of dead notes, but that you actually have living, reflective writing to work from. Manage yourself, manage your time, which always has to mean managing it your way, because time is a very different thing to all of us. But most of all, be honest with yourself about your work, because independent study, if not approached in the right way, is a tremendous opportunity for self-deception and for pretending things are going well when perhaps they're not. Seek support. Academic support are there. All sorts of other college agencies are there if you have a problem. It's better to go early if you feel you need support and help rather than leaving it until you're in a crisis with 1 week to go until hand-in or something like that. A lot of good reading. If you want to read more about the process of actually researching and developing project ideas, I'd really recommend Stella Cottrell's books on critical thinking and dissertation. The Watson book, although it's quite old now, about writing a thesis, is also very good. Anything by Jenny Moon on reflective practice or learning journals, and that in the case of this one, is also very well worth looking at. I hope you found this material useful. I've been going through today, and I look forward to giving you the second half of this session of 2 talks, which is about writing and about completing written work to a deadline and to as high a standard as you're able to achieve. So thanks very much for listening to me, and I hope you'll join me again for the second half of this 2-part series of lectures. So bye for now.